Welcome to the Religion Unplugged podcast. I'm Matthew Peterson. On today's episode, I'm talking to Sarah McCammon, a national political correspondent for NPR, about her book, The Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. Sarah, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So to start, I'd really like to just give you a chance to say, who did you envision as you're writing this? Who was the audience that you're writing it for? And then why do you believe what you're doing with this book is important?
I envisioned a couple of audiences for it. The most obvious one is fellow ex-evangelicals, people who grew up in evangelical environments that have maybe renegotiated, reframed their faith in some way. That can look a lot of different ways for different people. But I think what's similar is that coming from especially American evangelicalism, there's kind of a distinct subculture that includes, a lot of the same kinds of media and almost the same kind of language and experiences. And then for a lot of people, if they grew up that way, coming out of it and sort of trying to figure out what they believe about it, who they want to be, there can be sometimes some isolation around that and a sense of confusion and fear and loss. And so that's sort of the first audience. I was observing a lot of really interesting online conversations about evangelicalism and what's known as deconstruction, which is sort of a word that's emerged mostly online for that process I just described. And I wanted to write about it because it's something I recognized, from an earlier period of my life. And then the second audience is people who really have no context for evangelicals and want to understand them better. As somebody who has both grown up in the white evangelical subculture and then found myself many years later doing a lot of stories about evangelicals because I was covering American politics and they're such an influential group. I felt like I often found myself sort of called upon to explain evangelical thinking, evangelical support for Donald Trump, which of course evangelicals have been really his most important and reliable constituency of any sort of religious subgroup. And so I wanted with the book, I've tried to sort of paint a picture of that evangelical subculture and some of the ways of thinking and speaking and viewing the world, which I do think helps to explain or answer some of those questions.
Yeah. And I'm interested about the political side of things. In your chapter entitled Be Fruitful, Multiply, you talk about wanting to go to law school in order to be involved in politics to, quote, influence the culture and the political system for Christian values. So obviously evangelicalism is a very political term now and largely has to do with Trump. But how much of that political side of things was really relevant growing up? Do you feel like there was a strong political pull that was kind of essential and inseparable from your evangelical upbringing?
Yeah, for my family, there was. I think it's become, so I grew up in the 80s and 90s. I'm in my early 40s now. So I think that it has become, that alignment has intensified. Polling shows that white evangelicals are a more reliably Republican group than they ever were. And, when I was growing up, not everybody was as invested in the politics of it as my particular family was. But I think that I saw up close some of the thinking and some of the groundwork that was laid a long time ago with activists and groups like Focus on the Family, James Dobson, Ralph Reed and the Christian Coalition, and others who were influential then and still are today, and the organizations and networks they built are even more robust and influential than they were then. But for my family, really being an evangelical and being a Republican were inseparable. I knew hardly anybody who wasn't a Republican. And I remember I went to an evangelical college and having, like one classmate that I knew was a Democrat and just being surprised because I just didn't know anybody like that. And you mentioned I was kind of, it's interesting that the messages I got as a woman about, or as a girl becoming a woman about what my role would be were kind of mixed. I would hear a lot about the role of women as wives and mothers and the importance of sort of keeping the home and prioritizing child rearing. I would hear a lot of concern about the idea of having a career, both from my mother and the mothers of some of my friends. And I think in that scene, I may have mentioned that because I was getting to a story about, a classmate in college whose mother specifically told me, and also told a friend of mine who wanted to be a doctor, that we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't go to law school or med school because it would take us away from our families. But I think law school was something that I thought about at that time, because one path that was open to me as a woman, or that was encouraged, was, above and beyond everything else, we were encouraged to do things that would make a difference in the world for Christ. And that was seen as the way that my particular segment of evangelicalism, one of the ways to do that was to influence politics. And so at that time, that was where I thought I saw myself going. As I talk about later in the book, I kind of, as I got a little bit older, realized that wasn't what I wanted to do. I didn't want to be in an advocacy space. And I actually found myself attracted to journalism because it was much more free of, ideology, and much more open to simply asking questions and trying to understand different perspectives. And that was something that I really, really found myself hungry for, because I hadn't had that opportunity as much as I would have liked within the evangelical subculture.
Yeah, and do you think, and forgive me for not having the timeline exactly correct in my head, do you think that exposing yourself to other points of views, kind of expanding your worldview with other experiences, did you choose to do that because you had a lot of doubts about evangelicalism, or do you think those conversations that you had contributed to your own deconstruction of your faith?
It was a little bit of both. I think primarily just incidentally being exposed to other points of view on the occasions when I had that opportunity did force me to think differently. A major character in the book is my grandfather, who was who'd come out as gay in the 80s after my grandmother passed away, and who was one of the few people that I knew who wasn't religious. And that was always for me kind of confusing and a foil for the things I was being told. I was my whole world was really, Christian school, church, this evangelical subculture that I was part of. And my grandpa was outside of that. And so I knew that there was a world outside of it, but it was one I was taught that was, kind of taught to fear and taught to pray for, and taught to try to convert people. And I describe, in the book, kind of as I got older, different moments when I would encounter people who were different, or who were fit sort of outside of that frame, and how that challenged me in various ways, to think differently about people of other faiths, or people of no faith, or certainly about gay people. And then I think some of my own experiences, as a girl and as a woman who felt a pull to very much to be a wife and mother, and I am, but also to do other things with my life. I really, from a young age, was just excited about, I loved school. I loved the library. I loved learning. And I wanted, I had, like a lot of kids, probably a million things I wanted to do. I wanted to be an archaeologist, and I wanted to be an anthropologist. At one point I heard that word and I thought, oh, that's somebody who studies people. That sounds so interesting. And, and then politics that was again kind of an avenue where I was told you could serve God, as we were supposed to do. But I never really felt comfortable with the gender roles that were encouraged for me. I just, the thought of being a stay-at-home mom or something was just, and I don't want to disparage anybody who does that. And now that I have kids, I can understand sometimes why people would make that choice, because it's really, really hard to do it all. And kids need a lot of attention. But the idea that I couldn't do something else, that would be closed off to me, was just not appealing. And so for a whole bunch of reasons, I think I found myself questioning some of the things that I was being told.
Yeah, totally. You mentioned your grandfather, and he's such a key part, I think, clearly, of your entire life story and your journey with your faith. And in the final pages, you kind of recount what he says is, the purpose of being alive, right? The purpose of life, where he says it's to help our fellow man. And
Yeah.
you acknowledge in the book that that's, a biblical principle that Jesus speaks to. But clearly, ending with him, to me made it seem like there was something profound about him saying it that was different than the way that you'd probably heard things like it growing up. And I'm kind of curious, what was that difference?
I think for so much of my childhood, I opened the book talking about how we would pray at dinner every night for his salvation. And for so much of my childhood, I think I saw him as kind of an enemy would be too strong of a word, because he was my grandpa and, we loved him and we would spend time with him sometimes, at Christmas and major family occasions, although we weren't very close, and we were kind of at a distance in part because of his sexuality. My parents were, I think, fearful of exposing us to him and his lifestyle, as they would have put it. And so I think I was, while I loved him and was proud of him, he was a very accomplished neurosurgeon. I also sort of regarded him as someone who was lost and who needed to be saved, who we needed to pray for, who we needed to show the way, at least when I was young. And I think that having the opportunity as I got older to actually talk to him about what he actually thought, rather than interacting with some vision of him I had in my mind, just interact with him. It was eye-opening, because I think I realized that, one, I was maturing myself and I was becoming more sensitive to nuance and to the complexity of the world. And then two, to hear him sort of acknowledge it from a different direction was, it was a little bit surprising, I think, because in that letter that I quote from, he does talk about like his openness to the possibility of spirituality or of God, but just his unwillingness to assent to something he isn't sure about, to his desire to be authentic and to not be dishonest. And I really resonated with that, and I still do. And I think I realized that he and I probably had much more in common than I had realized.
Yeah. Yeah. And a little bit of a departure from that, but I'm curious. Your book's subtitle is Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. And I'd love to know your reasoning for why specifically, the fact that, what is it about your upbringing that the quintessential whiteness was really relevant to your story, and how is your upbringing in regards to race affected your experience interracial relationships today?
Well, I talked to my editor a little bit about whether to include the word white, and ultimately decided that we should, because, well, we're not just talking about politics, and this book is not just about politics. It is about, it touches on politics, and the politics of the white evangelical church are so different than the politics of, for example, Black evangelical churches or other groups. Just to take Black and white Christians in particular, when you look at their voting habits, they're pretty much polar opposites. Even among people who have very similar theological beliefs on paper, there's often a huge gulf politically. And I think that speaks to a real difference in experience, in history, in values and priorities that come out of that experience in history. And also because when we talk about white or evangelicals, as they sort of overlay with politics and culture, and when we talk about polling about evangelicals, usually you're talking about the white church. And certainly there are people of color, many people of color, who hold beliefs that are evangelical. But I think it's important to talk, to be precise about what we're talking about. Also the fact that while many churches, and I discuss this in the book, have made an effort to become more racially diverse and to be more inclusive, the history of Christianity in America really is segregated, and it still is today to a large degree. Not all churches, and some churches have made a lot of strides that way. But I think there's a distinct culture around the American church has historically been divided by race, and it makes a difference in terms of everything from theology to politics. So some of the things I described certainly apply to evangelicals across the spectrum, but I didn't want to speak beyond what I know and what I've experienced. And what I experienced was mostly, overwhelmingly white evangelical spaces. There's a chapter in the book where I talk to several Black Christians who've spent time in predominantly white evangelical churches and seminaries and so forth, ministries, about their experiences. And many of them told me that they found, particularly when political issues would come to a head, they found they often felt excluded and marginalized, and felt that their concerns and their needs were not a priority. And so I thought it was important to include that perspective, but I wanted to let other people tell their story, in their own words. So that's what I tried to do with that chapter. As far as how it shaped my own views, I mean, I have to say, I mostly grew up around white people most of my life. I had, one or two students in my classes growing up at, a small private Christian school who were not white. But that wasn't, the majority was overwhelmingly white. And that was the reality of my childhood. And I can't exactly answer for you how it shaped me, because I don't know what the alternative would have been like. But I do recognize that that's a limited view. It's a limited view of the world. It's a limited view of Christianity. And so that's something I've tried to become more sensitive to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And obviously there's a lot of, you talk to so many people for this book. It's just covered in interviews with a lot of people who come from evangelical backgrounds specifically, and are trying to figure out how to move on from a lot of things that were harmful to them. And I'm wondering if there is a singular interview that you did, because there were so many good ones, that stood out as one that you wish particularly that the active evangelical community would hear, would read, would understand. Is there a single interview that you think would be most important to kind of, I don't know, correcting things in the community, or allowing them to see things in a different light?
I couldn't possibly pick one, because I chose the people I chose because I think they all, in really evocative ways, touched on different pieces of the experience, all of which I resonated in one way or another. I will say, I think one of the most painful chapters to write was the one about LGBTQ Christians. Two of the people that I talked to are people I know personally. One is a friend from my childhood, and another was Jeff Chu, who's a writer who I know Jeff really professionally, but I know him personally as well. And just hearing the pain that they went through because of the challenges that their identity as gay men has created with their evangelical families, was sad and hard to hear. And of course, I was experiencing that kind of in reverse, because of my grandfather, who we had such a sort of strained and limited relationship with because he was gay. I know that must have been painful for him, and it's painful for me. I wish that we'd had a closer relationship when I was growing up. I wish there'd been more time together to be able to get to know each other. And I'm thankful that we had a lot of time together during my adult life. He lived a very long life, but I often wonder what it would have been like if we'd hung out on the weekends. And if when I'm I'm listening to Carl Sagan's The Demon Haunted World on audiobook right now. And, my grandpa was such a man of science and loved to learn. And I just think, oh, I wish I could talk to him about this book, And those are the things that like maybe we would have been able to do had our relationship been different, had we had more years together that were comfortable and easy. And that wasn't possible in that context. So I think I really can't just pick one interview, but I hope that, well, I will say I've heard from a few parents of adult children who raise their kids in the evangelical world and are now deconstructing to some extent. And several people have written to me, or I've seen a couple at events, and they've said that they appreciate the book and they're just trying to kind of understand where their kids are at. And I am so grateful to hear that, because I think the empathy is so important. And I want them to understand most of all that deconstructing or rethinking your faith or questioning your faith is not, I don't think for most people, it's about trying to hurt anybody or cause pain or cause tension in the family or the church. It's really about trying to be honest and about trying to be authentic and trying to understand the truth, whatever that is. And it's not an attack, it's not a personal attack. And I hope that comes through.
Yeah, I'm really glad you bring up parenting, because I have something else I'd like to ask about with that, because obviously so much of the book is about your upbringing and about the way that things that happened to you as a child ended up really complicating a lot of things as the older you got. And I'm just curious now, as you have, I think, two children, right? Do you have two children of your own?
I have two teenagers.
Okay, two teenagers.
Mhm.
How have you been talking to them about religion, about God, about the Bible, about what their grandparents believe? What does that look like?
So as they've grown up, I have just tried to be honest with them about what I do and don't know. I had their dad and I had them baptized in the Episcopal Church because we wanted to connect them with that tradition, with the Christian tradition, which had shaped us so much, but we also wanted to connect them with it in a way that felt authentic for us. And for me, being in the Episcopal Church was a place I found myself, in my early 20s, spending a lot of time, or at least some time, for a variety of reasons. I really appreciated the liturgy, which is so different from how I had been raised, but I found it to be really beautiful. I wanted to be in a church that was a little more inclusive and a little more open to, I think, theological questioning, which I felt that it was. And so we did baptize them, and we went to church together as a family periodically, but I can't say that I gave them a deep religious education. I was struggling so much with my own relationship to the church and trying to make sense of things. And I didn't want to pass on the negative parts. And I also didn't want to assert things that I didn't feel sure about to them. I didn't want to lie to them. So their dad and I both have told them over the years about how we were raised. We've exposed them to Christianity. We've taken them to services at times. Their dad, reads to the Bible to them sometimes. I think not so much in a didactic way, but just this is a really powerful book that you should know about kind of way. We're divorced and I'm remarried, and I'm in an interfaith relationship now. My husband is Jewish, and so now they've been exposed to that dimension as well. They've attended a Seder, at least one or maybe two, a couple Seders and a Passover. And we do Hanukkah traditions during the winter holiday season. So I've just tried to kind of, it means a lot to me. As much as I have baggage from my upbringing, it still means a lot to me. And I want to try to give them something, but I want to give them something that that feels real, and I don't want to pretend to be someone I'm not. So it's a tricky thing. I just, it's hard to, I've done so much synthesizing and thinking about religion, and it's like, how do you can't just pass that off to somebody like here,
Mhm.
So I don't know where they will land or what they'll do when they're older, but I've just tried to I've tried to expose them to it, as much as I can.
Yeah. I'd be curious, what, you talk about, I know you work for NPR, and you talk about briefly how your dad referred to it as like national, like liberal radio or something.
Perverted radio, yeah.
National perverted radio.
He doesn't, when I was writing the book, he said he didn't remember that. So I put a footnote in there that he said he doesn't remember that.
Yes, I saw that.
You
But I was
know,
just curious, what was like, I don't know that there's always a super favorable view of journalism in evangelical circles, especially now with Trump, with being very anti-journalist, it feels like. Not to get too, yeah. But how did you end up, other than just the want to hear other perspectives and stuff, which you talked about earlier, how did you end up in journalism as somebody kind of raised in evangelical circles, where maybe it wasn't like a super talked about thing, or maybe it was? It's just, yeah, if you could speak to that, I think that'd be interesting.
yeah, I always loved writing and words, and like, I was an English major, and I think, interested in doing something that would give, where I could get paid to write. And not that much, though, for people going into journalism, not that much. No, I've been incredibly fortunate. I have with my career, incredibly fortunate. But yeah, it was partly just sort of a natural outgrowth of my interests. And my dad has worked in media and communications field for a long time, so I think I sort of grew up exposed to that kind of work. And yeah, I just, when I was a kid, I would write stories, like fictional stories, and I got older and realized it's a lot more fun to write true stories because, man, I mean, the world is full of them, fascinating true stories. So I think it was some combination of just, a natural, my natural inclinations toward words and language and writing and reading, and also, like we talked about, just I was very excited about working in a space where I was able to learn so much about the world.
Yeah, totally. Okay, well, I think we've got everything we need, and I'm thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed uh I've really been enjoying your book and enjoyed talking to you, and yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you, Matthew. Take care.
All right, see you, Sarah.
Bye-bye.